For 106 years, one American shipping company crossed the Pacific without missing a single year through 2 world wars. American President Line's own chairman, Ralph Davies, made a call that bet the company's survival on a service jets were already erasing, one decision away from ending a century of dominance. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that decision cost and how the same company quietly built its way out. The same trap is closing today. Spirit Airlines just collapsed after cheaper flying, with no bailout coming. Go back to 1900 San Francisco, where Robert Dollar stood on the docks, betting his name on a shipping line. He wasn't building an empire yet. He was a lumberman who needed a cheaper way to move his own timber, and the shipping companies charging him for it were bleeding him dry. So he bought a boat, one steam schooner called the Newsboy, just to haul his own logs and cut out the middlemen. That's the entire origin story, not a vision of trans-Pacific glamour, not a master plan to connect America to Asia, a guy who was tired of paying somebody else's freight bill. Now, if you already know how this story ends, you're probably thinking, jets. The jet age arrived, ocean liners became obsolete overnight, and every steamship company on the Pacific got wiped out along with the President Cleveland. That explanation is not wrong. It is just too small. Planes absolutely gutted the passenger side of this business. But American President Lines didn't vanish when the jets came. It kept running ships for another 15 years after commercial jets crossed the Pacific. The company that finally sold its flagship for scrap in the early 1970s wasn't blindsided. It had known exactly what was coming since the late 50s, and it made a choice about what to do with that knowledge. That choice is the real story here, and it starts a lot earlier than the ship's final voyage. It also starts with a much smaller, much stranger scene than a company boardroom. Robert Dollar's one boat became a fleet almost by accident. He kept adding ships to move lumber up and down the Pacific coast, and by the 1920s, his sons had turned that lumber hauling operation into something much bigger. A full trans-Pacific passenger and cargo line, complete with a round-the-world service, ships named after U.S. presidents, and a red and white dollar sign painted on every funnel. It was audacious. It was also, it turns out, built on debt the company couldn't actually support. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. This was never purely a shipping company living off ticket sales. From very early on, its survival depended on the U.S. government. Mail contracts. Later, subsidies written directly into federal law, designed to make up the gap between what it cost to run an American crewed ship and what it cost to run a foreign one. Everyone thinks this is an ocean liner story, glamorous ships, first-class dinners, sailing to the Orient. It's actually a subsidy story. The ship was the part you could photograph. The government check was the part that kept the company alive. And when the Great Depression hit and Robert Dollar's sons kept expanding anyway, bigger ships, heavier debt, half-empty passenger decks, that dependency became a trap of its own. By 1938, the Dollar family owed the government millions of dollars they could not repay. The U.S. Maritime Commission took control of the company outright, wiped away the Dollar name, and renamed it American President Lines. The founding family didn't lose a few ships. They lost the entire company they'd built, seized by the same government whose subsidies had kept it running in the first place. That's not a footnote. That's the first time this business proved it could not survive without help, decades before anyone had heard of a jet engine. To understand why any of this mattered, you have to understand what a trans-Pacific crossing actually was in this era. This wasn't a flight, it was an event. A round trip from San Francisco to Manila and back took about 6 weeks. Honolulu, then Yokohama, then Kobe, then on to Hong Kong and the Philippines, with first-class passengers dining in white tablecloth rooms, while economy passengers, often immigrants and laborers, rode several decks below for a fraction of the price. It was slow, formal, stratified by class, and for the people who could afford it, it was one of the most glamorous things you could do with your money. San Francisco wasn't just a home port, it was the American gateway to Asia, and this company, under its old name and its new one, had essentially owned that gateway since 1867, when the very first regular steamship service to Asia launched from the same docks. Two rivals worked the same waters: Matson, which mostly ran the shorter Hawaii routes, and a smaller upstart called Pacific Far East Line, founded by a former Dollar Line executive. And looming behind all of them was NYK, the resurgent Japanese shipping line rebuilding fast after the war. All of that competition mattered, in the way rival ships always mattered on a route like this, undercutting fares here, adding a stop there. None of it, though, was the real threat. The real threat wasn't sailing on the water at all. It was flying several miles above it. American President Lines, freshly renamed and government-controlled, actually thrived through the war years and into the peace that followed. Its ships were requisitioned during World War II. One of them, the earlier President Cleveland, was torpedoed and sunk off North Africa in 1942 while serving as a U.S. Army transport. That same year, the company's other flagship, the President Coolidge, struck friendly mines and sank off the New Hebrides while carrying American troops. But when peace came, the company came roaring back. In 1947, a brand new President Cleveland launched from a Bay Area shipyard, built for the post-war boom in trans-Pacific travel. Her maiden voyage left San Francisco on December 27th of that year with a capacity passenger list of 550 people aboard. And a sister ship, the President Wilson, joined her the following year. This was the company at its absolute peak, the American flag flying on the biggest, newest liners crossing the Pacific, a genuine symbol that the United States still dominated ocean travel the way it dominated everything else after the war. The company's president through most of this boom, George Killian, had come out of politics, not shipping, but he understood exactly how to sell those ships, to Washington, to the press, to the traveling public, as proof that America still ruled the Pacific the way it had before the war ever started. For a while, the sales pitch matched reality. Government officials, military families, and tourists filled the decks, and the ships themselves became minor celebrities, showing up in magazines and even the occasional Hollywood picture. In 1952, a group of private investors led by an oil executive named Ralph Davies bought the company back from the U.S. government outright for just over $18 million, ending 14 years of federal ownership. That wasn't spare change changing hands. It was a serious personal financial bet that the passenger business Davies was buying into still had a future worth owning outright. Davies became chairman, and Davies believed deeply and personally in the passenger liner business. That belief is the decision this whole story has been building toward. Not yet the full shape of it, but the man is now in the room, and so is the bet he's about to make. Here's what makes that belief so strange in hindsight. The very same year Davies bought control of the company, commercial jet travel was already being tested across the Atlantic. Within 6 years, in 1958, jets crossed that ocean commercially for the first time, and that single year became the first year in history that more people crossed the Atlantic by plane than by ship. Not gradually, immediately. An entire industry that had operated the same way for over a century got flipped in 12 months. It wasn't a slow decline anyone could ignore their way through. It was a cliff. and everyone in ocean shipping, including the leadership of American President Lines, watched it happen from across the country and knew with total certainty that the Pacific was next. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume the company didn't see this coming, that it sailed blindly into obsolescence. It didn't. In 1958, the exact year jets went commercial, American President Lines had plans on the table for a brand new superliner to be called the President Washington, a 1,500 passenger ship that would have been the largest liner ever built on the West Coast. It needed federal funding to get built, the same kind of subsidy that had propped this company up since before it even had its current name. Congress said no. That single refusal is easy to miss in the history books, buried under a company that kept sailing for another 15 years. But it was the moment the U.S. government itself stopped believing new investment in American passenger ships made sense. The company didn't get the memo that its business model was already obsolete years later, when the ship was finally scrapped. It got the memo in 1958 in writing from the same institution it depended on. This was not bad luck. It was the first wall closing in, years before anyone outside the boardroom would have called this a company in trouble. And it left the company in an awkward position that would define the next 15 years, still legally and financially able to run its existing ships, but explicitly cut off from ever replacing them with anything newer or bigger. A fleet frozen in place while its market kept moving. And once that first wall went up, the rest came fast, stacking on top of each other in a way no single explanation captures. Jets kept eating the passenger market through the early 60s, and by the time regular jet service reached the Pacific, the writing was everywhere. Load factors on the great liners started slipping, fewer paying passengers filling the same expensive decks, the same size crew, the same fuel bills, the same fixed costs, whether the ship sailed full or half empty. That's the trap of owning your own fleet. The bills don't shrink just because the customers do. Across the bay, Matson felt the same pressure and simply gave up on passengers, laying up its own flagship, the Matsonia, in late 1962 and walking away from the passenger business entirely by 1970. The smaller San Francisco rival, Pacific Far East Line, hung on longer chasing the same declining market and finally went bankrupt in 1978. That's the part that still bothers me. None of these competitors got undercut by a rival shipping line. They got undercut by an industry that didn't even exist a decade earlier. And every single one of San Francisco's Pacific passenger operators eventually hit the same wall, one after another. Inside American President Lines, the pressure split the leadership in two. One side, led by Davies, kept believing passenger service could be salvaged, modernized, made relevant again. The other side had already started quietly building something else entirely. Standardized steel shipping containers, loaded straight off trucks and trains onto ships without ever touching a passenger's suitcase or a dining room. It was slower to capture headlines than a luxury liner, but it didn't need full passenger decks to make money. It just needed boxes. And the boxes were winning, quietly, in the accounting. Containers went from a minor sideline to nearly a quarter of the company's business by 1969, and then to well over half of it just 2 years later. That's not a company slowly declining. That's a company changing what it actually was faster than its own public image could keep up with. By the late 1960s, that argument inside the company had become impossible to paper over. In 1968, the company's president, Raymond Ickes, resigned in the middle of that exact fight over which direction to take the business. That's not a retirement. That's a company visibly disagreeing with itself, about whether the thing that made it famous was worth saving. Which sounds fine until you realize what that indecision actually cost. While the argument dragged on, no one ordered a replacement passenger ship. Not one. The aging President Cleveland and President Wilson kept sailing on borrowed time, no younger sister ships coming up behind them, no new investment flowing into the business Davies still championed. And then, in 1973, the oil crisis hit, spiking fuel costs across the entire shipping industry at the worst possible moment for a fleet already running on fumes financially. One pressure, jets, would have hurt badly on its own. Layered with a canceled superliner, an internal leadership war, an aging fleet with no successor ships, and a fuel crisis arriving right on schedule, survival stopped being a realistic option. Nobody killed this company with one decision. They just kept adding weight to a structure that had already lost its foundation back in 1958. Take away the canceled superliner, and the company might have modernized its fleet in time to compete. Take away the leadership split, and it might have committed fully to containers years earlier, with less wasted time and money defending a shrinking business. Take away the oil crisis, and the old ships might have limped along a little longer. None of those alone was fatal. Stacked together in that order over that many years, they left absolutely no room for error. And by 1973, there was no error left to make. The decision was already final. It just hadn't been announced yet. So here's what that actually looked like physically on the water. Both liners had statutory retirement ages under federal shipping rules, and by the early 70s, the President Cleveland was approaching hers. In February of 1973, she was sold, not scrapped yet, sold to a Hong Kong-based shipping group known as the C.Y. Tung Group, reflagged under a foreign registry and renamed the Oriental President. The company that built her, sailed her, and once treated her as a symbol of American dominance no longer owned her. 2 months later, her sister ship, the President Wilson, completed one final round-the-world voyage and was retired the same way, renamed the Oriental Empress. That voyage quietly closed something enormous. 106 years of unbroken trans-Pacific passenger service by this company and the businesses that came before it, gone, with barely a headline. The renamed Cleveland didn't even get a long second life. Within about a year, she was towed to a scrapyard in Taiwan and broken apart for steel. Her sister sat laid up in Hong Kong, unable to find enough business in a shipping world reshaped by the oil crisis, until she too was finally scrapped in 1984. 2 ships that had once been the pride of an American fleet ended their working lives under foreign flags, broken down for scrap metal on the other side of the ocean they used to cross. Notice what did not happen in that sequence. There was no dramatic bankruptcy announcement about the passenger business, no liquidation sale broadcast on the news. The ships were simply sold, quietly, the way you'd sell off an asset that no longer fit the plan because by 1973 it didn't. The other side of the argument inside the company, the container side, had already won. This was not a company going bankrupt. It was a company amputating the part of itself that could no longer justify its own existence. That amputation had a real cost that doesn't show up in a corporate timeline. For decades, ships like these had carried more than tourists. They carried military families being reunited after deployments. They carried immigrants building new lives across an ocean. In the years after World War II alone, an estimated 45,000 Japanese women who had married American servicemen crossed the Pacific on liners exactly like this one, starting entirely new lives on the other side of a 6-week voyage. For San Francisco, this wasn't background industry, it was 100+ years of identity as America's front door to Asia, An entire waterfront economy of piers, agents, and departures built around ships leaving on a schedule. Crews who'd organized their entire working lives around those sailing schedules lost more than a job. They lost the rhythm their whole career had been built on. When the routes ended, that identity didn't get replaced with something else. It just went quiet. A canceled sailing wasn't just an inconvenience for someone counting on it to see family overseas or start a new life in a new country. For people with fewer options and less money than a first-class passenger, it could be the only affordable way across that ocean at all. And after 1973, it simply wasn't there anymore. A refund for an unused ticket doesn't give any of those people back the thing they actually needed, which was the crossing itself. So what actually destroyed the President Cleveland? Not jets alone. That explanation is real, but incomplete. The full answer is that a company built on government subsidy, led by a chairman personally committed to a fading passenger business, watched Congress reject its last shot at staying competitive in 1958, spent the next decade divided against itself instead of replacing its aging ships, and ran straight into an oil crisis with nothing left in reserve. Davies died in 1971, still chairman, still believing in the ships. His own company retired its flagship the following year. This was not bad timing. He was the last man defending a business that had already lost the argument. He just never had to watch the ship actually leave for the scrapyard. Here's the part that makes this more than a sad ending, though. The company itself did not die in 1973. The side of that internal argument that lost, the passenger side, is the part everyone remembers, because it's the part with the glamorous ships and the photographs. But the side that won kept the business alive for decades afterward, hauling standardized containers instead of first-class passengers, eventually getting absorbed into much larger shipping conglomerates that still carry its name today as a small piece of an enormous global operation. The brand survived. The system that made it famous did not. Those are not the same thing, and mixing them up is exactly how people end up thinking jets alone explain any of this. And that's the trap worth watching for right now, not just in history. Spirit Airlines ran on cheap fares and thin margins for over 3 decades, kept those low fares as its entire identity, even as bigger, better capitalized airlines learned to copy the cheap seat model without carrying Spirit's same fixed costs. And when the pressure finally became unsurvivable, there was no government rescue waiting on the other side of it. No subsidy, no buyer stepping in with public money, just a wind-down notice and grounded planes. Different decade, different mode of travel, same underlying mechanism. A company whose entire value depended on cheap access to movement, competing against rivals who could absorb losses it couldn't, with nobody obligated to catch it when it fell. Some transportation systems get protected because society decides moving people matters enough to subsidize. Others get left to the market entirely. The difference between those two outcomes has decided who keeps flying, sailing, and driving for over a century, and it's still deciding it today. There's one more twist worth sitting with. The very business that this company escaped into, container shipping, the boxes that quietly won the internal argument decades ago, is now facing its own version of the same pressure. Too many ships chasing too little cargo, rates sliding, weaker carriers getting swallowed by bigger ones. The company outran one collapsing business by building another. It never actually escaped the cycle, it just bought itself more time inside a different one. The dock where the President Cleveland used to leave San Francisco on schedule, packed with passengers headed for Honolulu and beyond, doesn't have a ship like her leaving from it anymore. It never will again. The ship didn't lose to the jet engine. It lost to a company that had already quietly decided, years before the final sale, to become something else entirely, and simply hadn't told the ship yet. If you enjoyed this one, there's plenty more where it came from. So hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Did your family ever cross the Pacific on the President Cleveland or the President Wilson, or watch a doc like that one go quiet for good? Tell me in the comments.